Well, thank you all for coming. The first question I'd like to ask everyone is, how many of you out there are surfers or have surfed? Yeah, see, there we go. Now we don't have to worry about that anymore. Well, that puts us a lot at home, because I think one of the things that I wanted to start out with is that something about Americans in general is that we tend to be somewhat insular. And growing up in a place like Hawaii or other islands or other places in the world, we find ourselves not the Roman Empire that we think of ourselves as, and we find ourselves a minority where we usually aren't used to being that. And one of the things that I think so many people that I talked to when I first talked about reading this book, that people said is how they related to the idea of having been to a place like Hawaii, those who lived in Hawaii, those who visited there, and other islands and other cultures, and how much they appreciated and how much it resonated with them, the way that Bill told the story of how that feels, how that experience comes across, because not many Americans actually get a chance to do that. So I guess my first thing I'd love to hear from Bill is what I know you say you didn't live there a long time, but I think it must have had a great mark on you, because what you wrote was, in my mind, just so real and so accessible to anyone who's had that story.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, it's the first chapter of this book is about living in Hawaii. I was about 13. We had moved there I grew up in Southern California, and I've been surfing for a few years. My dad got a job in Hawaii, so we moved to Honolulu, and it was just like this total dream come true for me. You're all raised on images of Hawaiian surfing, and we live near the beach and backside of Diamond Head, and I had this kind of double experience, or schizophrenic experience, because I was the oldest of four. My parents were concerned with the little ones. They just told me that junior high is that way. And I went and found it and went to this school called Kaimiki Intermediate. And it was quite a rough school. It was really racialized. The education was terrible. It was like mission colonial traditions kind of dominating the thing. And they give you an IQ test and put you in a stream of, it was just, and the tensions weren't really clear to an outsider, except everybody wanted to beat you up. And soon enough, somebody mentioned this whites-only gang, this little group of haoles, as they're called in Hawaii, approached me and said, we see you're like beefing with the other people, and yeah, I don't have a choice. It seems like, well, yeah, you can join us. And there were these little really bad kids, these white kids. And so I kind of started hanging with them. So that was sort of one experience, a lot of fighting and strife, and having to sort of, I'd grown up in a quite white suburb of Los Angeles, so this is my first experience of being in a racially intense situation and being, as Jim said, in a minority. There were just not very many white kids at all, but they weren't so great either. Anyway, meanwhile, I was exploring the waves out front of where we lived, around the back of Diamond Head and in front of Diamond Head, and I made some friends in the water. It took a little while, but you sort of need friends in the water. And I hooked up with these three brothers, one of whom was my age, the Kalakakuis. Roddy Kalakakui is my age. His brother Glenn was older and a really, really good surfer, and so was Roddy. And they had a younger brother, John. And so I had this kind of heaven and hell life for quite a while, where school was rough and black eyes, and surfing was just dreamy. The waves were, and the way people surfed, the waves themselves, I'd mainly learned in Ventura and LA, and little funky Farmer John wetsuits, and now here we were out there, and everybody had, the styles were completely different. We were still, this is longboards, I don't know how many of you know the 60s history of surfing, but we were still on longboards, and so it was nose riding, and that's what I was doing, and these Hawaiian guys were like, and just various maneuvers that were very mainland, and they were doing a kind of surfing that sort of adapted better to shortboards when they came along. But I really, really admired these guys, and stuck close to them, and got to know the heroes of the place, not personally, and I wasn't allowed to know them, but people like Leslie Wong and Wayne Santos and Ben Ipa would show up on a good day at our little spot cliffs, and it was really just dreamy. And so it was a sort of foundational for me, I guess. We moved back to the mainland for about a year, I guess, and then moved back again to Hawaii. And my dad got another job. He became a kind of Hawaii specialist, and he was in TV and movies. And eventually my family lived there for many years, but I was only there part of the time. And it was, yeah, I came back to the mainland, and it all seemed very sort of pale and weak. And I was keen to get back to Hawaii. I surfed a lot better from having lived there, I thought, and was really pleased. And then later, as soon as I dropped out of college, I moved to Maui. Hawaii was my lodestar for a long time. But Maui was a whole completely different experience. Nothing like this kind of. Shortboards had come, the counterculture had come. It was full of other people learning to surf. I mean, getting into Hawaii and Hawaiians, but not so many local surfers on Maui at that time. And so that was a completely different type of experience. But Hawaii was foundational. I mean, I had later became a journalist, much later, and I spent most of my so-called career, I guess, reporting overseas, international stories, conflicts, and I think John said something about this, and where I'm often, like in a world of people not speaking the same language as me and not looking like me, and people have said, well, you got started early with this kind of work. And I'm not sure they really go together, but there's this superficial similarity, at least.
And you brought up Maui, so I just wanted to touch on that, because one of the things that he mentioned, I think, is really true too, is for those of us who are old and lived through that period, it was a period of really lots of social upheaval and change, and the 60s and the early 70s through the 70s really were really a tumultuous period, and there was a lot of change. And surfing, I suppose because of the baby boom, sort of mirrored that. We sort of had the same kinds of changes, and so everything that went through was not only cultural, but also from the standpoint of, like I said, in 1966, 1967, boards started to go short and hair started to go long, and the whole world kind of changed, and that experience sort of began to tune in on the people that were our age then, which was in our early 20s, to be traveling. There was no professional circuit then. So the way that you sort of earned your merit badges, as you might think, was to go to these places that were sort of the storied, legendary waves that you'd heard about, and ride them and seek them out. And that was something that I think Bill did probably more so than most people I know. But Maui was a really special place, and I wonder if you could just comment on how that counterculture kind of experience, where you were at the different times. If you could just comment on it as to what what was going on at that time, and how it might have shaped your thinking.
Well, I was 18, I think, when I moved to Maui, after 1 year of college, and I was already kind of a reactionary, actually. I was like this premature anti-hippie, and I worked in this bookstore in Lahaina, and tried to get people to read real books instead of just this Baba Ram Das crap they were reading. And that's the people who came in, the tourists came in for a different kind of books. So I was already sort of, and my girlfriend, who was the same age as me, was even more kind of cynical and advanced. So we were really like in a sort of world of ourselves, as this other stuff, this kind of drug-soaked, back to the land stuff, and other sort of embarrassing pretensions swirled around us. I was just, wanted nothing to do with it. Actually, to revert to the book, Maui was a sort of epicenter of this sort of thing. There's a unintentionally hilarious movie called Rainbow Bridge, which probably nobody's ever seen. It's about Jimi Hendrix coming to Maui, and the Venusians come down to meet him up in the volcano crater, and I know a bunch of people who were involved in that. And it was hard to tell whether they were tongue-in-cheek or just, but it was a perfect sort of relic of the age. But later, when I went to write this book, I'd had an idea to write it, just a series of chapters. It was actually based on a magazine piece I did for the New Yorker, but when I decided to do a bigger book, each chapter was going to be about a surf spot, one break in tremendous detail, and the sort of guy I surfed there with, the friend who I surfed it with. And that's how it's going to be. It's like this really macho, super masculine thing. It was just going to, And when I got to the Maui chapter, it was like the third or fourth chapter in the book, my girlfriend just completely took it over. I mean, she was like way more interesting than any people I surfed with. And I realized this book's going to have to be a little bit different. She was a huge influence on me in many ways. And later was one of the many interlocutors. This is, as you've heard, I mainly done journalism through my career at the New Yorker and in general, writing about other people's problems. But to do a memoir is completely different. Thinking about yourself and sort of writing about private life. None of this was on the record, and you just arrogate to yourself the right to start writing about your friends and loved ones and what happened. So you have to think hard about what you're going to include, and you also have to go back to them and see if you can agree on what happened, which you never can. And some of the episodes with her just went on forever about what happened and what didn't happen, and who had the right to these stories. Those kind of questions come up. But I was glad. I mean, I was grateful for her in my life generally, but also for the way she kind of blew the book apart and made it a completely different type of book than what I'd planned. I should say that this book actually started here in San Francisco. I was living here in the 80s and freelancing, and I wrote my first little piece for the New Yorker in '84. It was written from Nicaragua about the Contra War that was going on then. I was down there for another magazine, and they bought it, short piece, and somebody who worked in the editor's office said, if you want to write anything longer for the magazine, which I did, I should, you got the editor's attention, you should propose it now. And so I thought that meant like I had 5 minutes, for a turn. And so I couldn't come up with an idea, and I just proposed a profile of the guy I was mainly surfing with at Ocean Beach. And I saw it as a kind of John McPhee type. He was this kind of brilliant guy and big wave surfer and the sort of intellectual outdoorsman. And they bought it. I mean, I got the assignment. And so the piece took me 7 years to write. Missed a couple deadlines, and which that's a whole other story. But when it finally came out, I'd long moved to New York and was working for the New Yorker, and I finally wrote this goddamn thing that had been assigned. I did published 3 books in the meantime, and that got my publisher's attention. Let's just turn. It was a really long piece, like 40,000 words. Let's just bring that out as a book, but I didn't want to. And I said, I've got a lot better stories than just this San Francisco thing. Okay, write them. So that's what set me to doing it, with at first a very kind of pin-headed idea of what it would be. If you're interested.
I think that one of the things about surfing that is, well, there are a lot of unique things about surfing, but one of the things that's unique about it is that, particularly for the group of people that grew up in the what we call the early modern age of surfing, which was when foam was invented, and so surfboards could actually be made in mass and supply the demand that was always been there. But shaping a board out of wood is, you can only make so many of them so quickly. But with foam and fiberglass, which was the new technologies of the post-World War II era, suddenly we had this huge burst of technology that allowed a lot of things to happen. And one of them was that you could make hundreds of surfboards in a week, and there were many people doing that. And so this tribe that sort of grew up from that really had a sort of a perspective, an ethos about what they were. They identified as surfers first, and then whatever else they were doing afterwards. And one of the things that because I remember very distinctly when that piece came out, and what it kind of captured, which really none of us had really thought about before, was how much of a tribal experience surfing was. And whether you're in the Bay Area, in Santa Cruz, or you're in La Jolla at Big Rock, or whether you're at Trestles in Orange County or Malibu, in LA, or points north and south and east and west, that tended to be, those cultures tended to spring up and be, in a very, very short time, a sort of culture of its own, a tribal aspect of its own. And that was something that, was captured in that first story. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the Ocean Beach surfers and that tribe from there, because it's sort of like Sioux and Arapaho and Iroquois. It's like they're different, but they're all from a tribe that identifies as Native Americans, in this case with surfers. And that's something that I think most people don't do. Most people don't identify themselves as football players when they're 13, but surfers do. I mean, at least in this era they did. So,
well, San Francisco had very few surfers then, and in fact, I was always meeting people in San Francisco who were from San Francisco who said there's no surfing in San Francisco. I say, well, there is. They say, no, it's too rough, it's too this, it's too that, no surfing. And you could actually drive by it on the Great Highway, and there's guys out there, but you wouldn't notice them. So, I mean, there weren't enough surfboards around that anyone would notice them. And that's how it was in the early 80s when I first lived here. Excuse me. And it was actually, I eventually understood it better. I didn't at first. But there were sort of two levels. There were locals, kids, guys it was all men, who'd all gone to school together and to high school together and were like locals. Ocean Beach, mainly lived in the Sunset District and knew each other from forever and come up the hard way. Like when you were small, you weren't even allowed in the water. You just had to build fires on the beach. And if you build good enough fires, eventually you're allowed to, paddle out or something. And I hear all about the hard knocks of the old days and some that I couldn't even believe. So there was that group, and then there was a second group that I was part of people who came from somewhere else as adults who could already surf and didn't learn here. I thought it was impossible to learn at Ocean Beach because it is so rough, but there are people who did, or they'd maybe like surf at Fort Point or somewhere gentle, to try to get their chops together. But basically, they learned it at Ocean Beach. And these are guys who would go to the beach on their bicycles. This was not people with any money. And so there's that group, and then there was a second group of like professionals, let's say yuppies, like me, coming in with sort of more education and like coming from Hawaii and Australia and Southern California and other places. And it all seemed kind of seamless to me. I didn't notice any kind of rift between those two until I started reporting on the place. And that's when it became clear, these guys don't like that guy, but I hadn't noticed it surfing with people because everybody was on a first name basis. I mean, a lot of times you couldn't, especially if there was any swell, if it was big, you couldn't get anybody to go out with you. And you didn't want to go out alone. So you'd be up and down trying to find somebody to surf with. It was that uncrowded. And on a mellower day, it'd get a little more crowded, but it never got crowded. And it's a wonderful, wonderful wave for much of the year, fall, winter, and some of the spring. It's one of the best beach breaks I've ever seen. And so I loved it, but it was, I loved it. I mean, the culture, such as it was, like this guy I ended up writing about used to have slideshows. Remember slideshows, anybody? In his apartment down on the water, on the ocean, on this Great Highway, and everybody was there, and everybody, all these jokes are flying, and they're all in jokes, and like that's not you, because I mean, it was really, really a fun group, and I was really happy to get to know them. And there were some weirdos. There was a really eccentric guy who lived in the parking lot and traded stocks and said he went to Harvard Business School, and he was this really strong guy. We call him Sloat Bill, and he hated me because I was this kind of skinny character, but I could. It's hard to get out there often. It's just a lot of white water and duck dive, and he couldn't really. He was sort of, and he couldn't like slip under the waves so easily, and I could, and he could like beat me up with one hand, but he so there were all kinds of little weird resentments and jokes running around all the time. And when I made fun of his surfing, he didn't take it very well. In fact, I later described him as like a redwood log rolling around in the white water. Should not have done that. But it was a pretty neat scene, I thought. And as I say, the sort of rifts in it, and I knew people on both sides, were later revealed. And the intensity of the surf cold water, relatively. It doesn't seem that cold to me now because I live in New York City and surf all winter, but relatively cold. And wetsuits were relatively bad, so you really got cold. You come in with your hands too numb to drive your car, and just it was intimidating. It wasn't super dangerous really, but it felt dangerous often. And so it was often like you knew, say there were this many surfers in all of San Francisco, you knew this guy will go out when it's 6 feet and under. This guy will go out when it's like maybe 8 feet. This guy, no. And you just knew what everybody's limit was. And you see something, you go, oh, if he's paddling out, I got to go out because I'm braver than him, I think. And that was an intense thing, which I'd seen plenty of other places in Hawaii and other places, but it was really tight here. And so you'd get guys who were kind of, macho, kind of made men, OG type surfers here. It's a little big, and they're just kind of sitting in their cars watching, and they'd get really pissed off if some, flighty newcomer like me paddled out. So there were those kind of tensions, but that's boys.
So jumping ahead just a moment, just because I think a lot of people would know, tell us about how you went from your sort of wandering surf career years to actually becoming a serious journalist and developing that. Because I think that's a part that isn't really maybe in the book as much as a lot of other things. So for me, it would be interesting to know, and I think for a lot of other people, from their own career standpoint, they look at this. That's always the sort of seminal period, right? Like how did you make that leap there, or how did that develop?
Well, I'm not. I say I'm a journalist, and I report fact, long fact, short fact, opinion pieces, but I've never worked at a newspaper, so not hard news. New Yorker's a weekly. Online you get things up pretty fast, but it's not hard news, and it's more writing than it is just the facts. And so I did a couple of degrees in English, and I wanted to be a writer. I wrote poetry, I wrote a lot of fiction, wrote 3 novels, and those were my aspirations. They were literary. And I tell you, I was a really slow learner, slow developer. Because at some point, I realized that my fiction wasn't that good. And I worked on it all the time. If you read my journals through those years when I actually left the US and was just traveling around the world surfing, but working jobs, but surfing was seemingly what I was doing. My journals have almost no surfing in them. It's all just about like my current writing project and why is this not working and why is this character, how about this scene goes over there and that kind of stuff. And I was telling somebody that on one of the best days of surf I've ever had in my life, maybe the best day, my journal for that day just reads, "Today was the day." No, there was nothing to say about surfing as far as I was concerned. I've been doing it since I was a kid. I just did it, like, automatically. It was like a bad marriage. You just don't talk. You just do it. And it was only much later. Actually, a guy I wrote about here, was kind of trying to force me to be more self-conscious and to take surfing more seriously. It was a constant thing between us. I just said, "What's there to say? Fuck it," And his attitude was like, "It's everything. Surfing is everything." He was just like high priest of surfing, and it kind of worked for him. He was a doctor. He had a big career as a cancer specialist. Very smart guy, but my fiction career was not flying. And in the course of these travels and jobs, I ended up in South Africa, which is like in the great endless summer cliche is where you go for the perfect wave, and there are some pretty perfect waves there. And so I went there, had to, and got a job teaching in a black high school in Cape Town. And it was a very intense political years in the bad old days of apartheid. And I got completely caught up in that. And by the time that year was over, I just didn't really care about the kind of romantic fiction I was writing. I just only really cared about power and politics. And so I switched to nonfiction. And at that time, I'd been reading the New Yorker kind of all my life, but and I realized later that for years I'd had the idea to write for the New Yorker, like, living in Australia, letter from Queensland, I can just see it, and I never did it, never submitted anything, but I was thinking that way. And so when I switched to nonfiction and started writing about politics, basically, and I wrote a couple books about South Africa and one about Civil War in Mozambique, and I sort of became a journalist, but I had to learn how to do it. You know, I hadn't been to school for it. I hadn't come up through a newspaper or internship or anything like that. So I kind of came in from over here, and I started freelancing, and I came back to the U.S. and I've been away a few years, and I'd like turned 30, and like, what am I doing with my life? So I was freelancing, and slowly made my way and sold first thing to the New Yorker, and then moved to New York and got on staff. And I don't know, maybe I'm better described as a writer than a journalist, but I'm writing. I sort of discovered through some writers at the New Yorker and other places, books that there's really beautiful documentary literature, you know, literary nonfiction that very much satisfied my ambitions. This is what I want to do now. You know, I wasn't so good at the other thing, and I turned to that. And as I say, surfing was just a later kind of idea. I was mainly writing about politics and conflict.
And with regards to surfing, just curiously, you often hear about this, but I was wondering for you because I know the people that are sitting in this room are all sort of thinking about what they can take away from this. And one thing I was wondering about is, are there lessons that you can learn, and were there lessons that you learned about surfing? I mean, about surfing and how it applies to the rest of the things that you do. I mean, and you're going, oh God. But
well, I'm trying to think.
Well, like for instance, Jerry Lopez. One of the things that Jerry Lopez said to me that was really meant a lot to me is you know, as you're getting older, and he just said, you just have to keep paddling. That was a statement. You just have to keep paddling, right? I mean, it's really simple, but it's incredibly profound if you think about it, because that's the only way that you get anywhere, right? That's how you travel in surfing, and so that's the metaphor that was there. I just wondered if for you, if there were things about timing, about you know, positioning, about understanding when to get out and when to get in, those kinds of things. Because you write about them as you're doing them.
Yeah.
So I wondered if they were things that you thought about outside of that.
Well, I don't know. A lot of the sort of small and large decisions you make in the course of surfing or not surfing, deciding not to go out, are specific to the thing itself. And if you've spent enough time doing it, a lot of these decisions are so complicated you can't get to the bottom of them. You know you want to be over there instead of over there, and you know you want to go in now or you want to. But I like that two-word summation, keep paddling, because it's and it's true. Like, it's no fun to get old as a surfer. Believe me, you just get worse and worse. It used to be good, and yet there are these sort of moments of grace, and that still come along. Sometimes just things you see, and sometimes things you do. But it is important to keep moving, and I was at a beach break on Long Island, I don't know, a couple years ago, trying to get out, and it was really consistent and sort of pounding me, and I was just trying to get out. Like, I mean, nothing like here, but same general idea. And I finally made it out and got a wave, and this friend was on the beach who doesn't surf, and I came in and I said to her, I don't know if this is worth it. And she said, that was insane watching you do that. And I said, why? She goes, now I know how you write books. You know, you just fucking wouldn't give up. And you just kept. I said, well, that's how you paddle out. You got to keep going, you know. If you say, oh, this is too much, and you give up, there's no point in being out there. And this place would teach that in a big way. I mean, really, because there's a combination here of like getting pounded, push back, and then it starts getting heavier. And often there's a formation called the inside bar where it breaks really hard, like harder than the big waves outside. Just, and you get near that, and you think, oh my God, do I even want to be here? And the answer is finally, no, I don't want to be here. And then there's like a hard current, like pulling you toward the wave. You know, and now you don't have any choice. You can't turn around and catch this white water. It's just. And so you sort of like duck dive that or swim under it or whatever, and then you're sort of spat out the back, and you're in this trough that on big days is often really big. It's like 50 yards. The outside waves are breaking, and then they're backing off, and you're in this in between. and nothing's happening, except everything's happening in both directions, and it's terrifying. And it's like, I can't go in, I can't go out. Like, why did I ever start surfing, you know? So there's tons of that here, the basic kind of grit lessons, and it always, I mean, pretty much always works out, you know. You get back to the beach eventually. And the outer waves, there's something, you know, it can break hard outside, but it's deeper. And so you can, you know, get underneath it better, and it's not as punishing as that inside bar. There's some metaphor there, I don't know what it is.
Well, I know one experience that I had that was really stayed with me a long time is when I was working at Surfer, we always had a house for a month on the North Shore to cover the season, and we always had this house right next to a couple of very legendary surfers. And one of the interesting things about Hawaii is because you don't have a continental shelf like we do here, you don't have the kind of conditions that change. So here it's glassy in the morning because the land hasn't heated up enough to bring the wind onshore, which crushes the waves. So everyone wants to go really early. Well, in Hawaii, they don't really have that problem. So most people don't surf early in the morning because they're either partying all night or they just don't bother because it's going to be just as good at 10 o'clock.
Or better.
Or better. And so I would always go out at dawn because I just thought, God, there's nobody here, you know? And so one morning I was paddling out, and it was a Pupukea, which is not really it isn't pipeline, but this giant set came, and I was paddling, and I was rolling these waves, and I was rolling these waves, and I was just getting hammered. And I thought, God, am I gonna get out? Am I gonna get out? And I was paddling, and I finally just saw this wave way out on the outside, and the lip was just feathering, and it was just gonna break, and I just went, I'm done. I turned around, caught the wave, rode it in, walked up the shore, kind of with my tail between my legs, you know, hoping nobody saw me, and I look up, and there are the two legends standing on their front porch, and they're both jumping up and down and screaming, right? And I was just going, oh, God, you know, please. And they're waiting for me to come over. And so I walk over, and they say, God, you're my hero. And I'm going, what are you talking about? I just got caught inside and got battered to bits and like had to paddle in. And they said, yeah, but you know what? You were one wave from being outside. And I never forgot that, because when things are really bad now, I always think, maybe I'm just one wave from being outside, you know, I just keep, you know. So, I mean, that's kind of what I was thinking when I was, you know, the sort of whatever you can take away from what the book is. And the book is full of, even though I don't know, and this is something that I think I'd like to talk about too, is a lot of what we do in life is unconscious, even though we're sort of preparing for it. And I feel like, you know, just reading it, I remember when he got to the part where he got this giant stack of New Yorkers, you know, on his travel trip, and he was reading them, and I remember being so pissed off because I thought, I subscribed to the New Yorker. And I never got through them because they're like 40,000 word pieces, and I never got done before the next one came. And then it was like, you know, old, and you had something else you needed to read, and I never paid the attention that I could just feel in what Bill was writing, this sort of attention to what that is, because the New Yorker is the best writing you find in you know, the United States at least. It's the best writer since back in the days of Hemingway and Fitzgerald and those guys, you know, and Sean Wallace and all the people that sort of edited them and built the New Yorker into what it is today, and it still is the premier, in my mind anyway, literary magazine there is, the best writing you can find. And I saw that was something that Bill was doing, and I don't think he was really even conscious of it, although it's great that I think some people understand where they're going before they actually get there. Most people don't. They just kind of suddenly realize that they're at it. But I just wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, because to me that was all prep.
Yeah. Well, I was traveling in those days, this is late 70s, with my best friend, also a surfer and a writer named Brian DeSalvatore. And we were living at Kira, and we both had jobs. I was bartending, and he was cooking in a Mexican restaurant. He pretended to be Mexican. They didn't know, Australians. And we were both working under fake names and getting amazing waves. And yeah, it was Christmas, and I saw in a secondhand shop a stack of New Yorkers for a penny a piece, like, you know, 100 or something, $1. So I bought a lot of New Yorkers and gave them to Brian for Christmas for $2. And And he was a very methodical reader, more than I was. And he had a little reading chair set up at his bungalow. We were kind of a little slum in Kira. And he just set them all up on this side of his chair, and he just worked his way through them. And he'd probably read most of them before, because we were both sort of long-time readers of the magazine, but we'd also been living in, Tonga, so we hadn't seen the magazine in a long, long time. These were old issues, and he just sort of methodically went through them, and he wasn't finished, I remember, when it was like a perfect present for him. And when we decided to leave, our visas were running out, and we set off on a trip around the country, and then across the middle, across the center, as they call it in Australia, which is just desert, the outback. To the north, we're going to Indonesia. And so we took the magazines he hadn't finished and stuck them into the front seat, and these long, endless, boring patches of road, we'd read stuff from the magazines and to each other. And it was really funny, because a lot of writers that we'd always admired, big names, great writers, some stuff we'd seen before, fiction writers, nonfiction, whatever, we'd read, and they just would fail the test. They just seemed like such posers, and wait a second, this kind of hot Outback light, they're not failing the Outback test out the window, and other people, Norman Mailer I loved, but fuck no, he's not really what we thought. And we were both, and we both ended up as staff writers at the New Yorker. Brian was also intent on that magazine, and so was I, but we wouldn't have guessed that we were both writing fiction in those days, so I don't think either of us would have guessed we'd end up there. But yeah, in retrospect. And then later, when I ended up working there, I didn't tell the people who I decided were phonies. Oh, we decided you were a phony in the desert, So it was down there, but I didn't know it for a long period.
So I think a question that has been asked of you, and we've actually talked about it before as ourselves, is that I think everyone thinks about when you have a really big achievement or a big achievement in your life, like the Pulitzer Prize. What transpires after that? And I just like you to comment on that too, because you have a great story about it, I think.
Well, it was a surprise that I won that. I got a call from my editor telling me, I said, I can't believe it. He said, I can't either. And I said, well, that's great, thanks. And he was very concerned that he's like an insider, so he knew before anyone else knew, and he especially knew before my agent knew. And he said, don't tell Binky, my agent, that I told you. Okay, why? Because she wants to be the person who knew before anyone else knew. So there's that. And I said, well, that's great, that's amazing, And then my first thought was, fuck, I wish my parents were still alive. They just died a few years before. And so I called my wife, and I said, you won't believe it, I book won the Pulitzer. And she said, oh, that's so great. God, I wish your parents were alive. and I said, oh, it's really the sort of thing like you do for your parents. So they can say, my kid, And it didn't make much, I don't know, maybe we sold some more books. It wasn't a big deal. They give out a lot of Pulitzers. And this editor who called me has probably won 2. So not the biggest thing, but it was nice. I wouldn't give it back. But my parents weren't around, so it wasn't the same.
Yeah. And I know my parents were always really worried about, one, me surfing and being a surfer, and the other thing was me being a writer, because they thought both of those were really losing propositions, and especially combined. So when I got the job at Surfer, I had on my door the last letter that my mother had sent me from when I was living in Europe, and I'd finally gotten some gigs. I was writing for an English language paper in Paris, and had gotten some things, and then I got this job at Surfer, and became the editor. And I had this note on the door, and my mom talking about me, and so at the very end of it she says, so have you found any work yet, or are you still writing? So I put that up on my door, kind of saying, yeah.
My dad was really intent on publishing, and I was writing from an early age. Like at 12, I was already writing lots of fiction and short stories and stuff. And he would say, you need to publish. Like, this is all right. He came from a small town in Michigan, and he was a journalist in his youth. And he kept saying, you just need to, like anything, obituaries, anything, you just need to. And I was just resisted that. And he'd say, "You're always looking in these surf magazines. Why don't you write something for one of those?" I said, "Dad, there's nothing I can tell them that they'd want to publish." And I said, "It's all about the photos anyway." He said, "I'll take the photos." I said, "No, you won't. You don't understand." I mean, he couldn't do it, I couldn't do it, but he was always on. And his basic attitude was, "Oh, you're still writing," for many years. And then when I finally started publishing, he wasn't hassling me anymore, but I didn't really get that, it meant that much to him. And in fact, I thought he was maybe a little jealous. I don't know, because he went into the film business instead of stuck with writing. And then years later, when I was on tour with this book, because more personal is sort of different, and I'd have people come up to me and say, "I worked with your dad," and I'd say, "Oh," because he made a lot of, pictures all over the place, and so he was so proud of you. I said, "What? God, why didn't he tell me?" I was just like choked up, and so it's writing doesn't seem like anything until it seems like something.
So, when you think about your work now, you're living in New York, and you surf there. How do you deal with trying to get the balance between surfing, which I know you are, like all of us, wish we had more time to do, and always seems like the older we get, the harder it seems to be to find the time to do that because you've got other commitments going, and the idea that you have also a pretty intense deadline of writing when you write. How do you balance those things? How do you find the time to do both the way you want it?
Well, it's kind of surf by day, write by night, if there are waves. But that is actually an effect on my life, a distinct and positive effect that the Pulitzer brought me, which was that I can actually say to my editors, "No, I'm going surfing." "Oh, yeah, well, you win Pulitzer Prizes that way, go ahead." Whereas I spent like 30 years lying before that. "I'm working on it, I'll be right there." Like I'm paddling out and telling a lot of lies. But yeah, I no longer need to lie. Surfing is now an excuse for not filing on time.
I love it. I love it.